I want to talk about the word yoni and why you choose to use yoni rather than vulva or
Yeah.
pussy or any of the other terms
I
we have.
use all of them, to be honest. I actually use vulva and vagina more than I use yoni even these days, but depending on what I'm doing. So if I'm doing a particular ceremony that I do feel like has some thread of connection to a tradition or a lineage that I've done, not that these practices that I'm sharing are what these traditional tantric practices were teaching, because they aren't. It's definitely my own interpretation, seeing the lack of connection to women's sexuality that happens in the spiritual world. So I kind of took it and ran. So, but when we do different practices and rituals that are working with a woman's pussy, and I think all the words are good, because I think we've been taught to like, that they're all, dirty words. So I think it's good to practice like saying words like pussy and vulva and vagina and yoni and all the words. Just like it's, I think, healthy to practicing death and dying, death and dying and death and dying. It's like we have so much stigma around these things, or sex, or, all this stuff. That I feel like it helps just to say the words and to normalize the fact that these are just very human things. And especially when it comes to the vulva and our vagina, these are just parts of our bodies. It's pretty simple, but it's obviously a loaded topic for a lot of really good reasons, And so I like using all the words, I guess, but I do find that yoni is a word that comes from India, and it holds a particular sacred energy within the context of the word, because it is referring to the anatomy, but it also is and can be used in the context of a principle or an energy, you could say.
Tell me about these practices. I think one was the mirror work.
When it comes to the sex education and the work that I do around that, I was trained by somebody named Deborah Sundal, who's been teaching about the G-spot for like 40 years. She is an elder in the sex education world. She's an amazing, amazing being and teacher of mine. And I think it's really important for us to have teachers and to also honor our teachers, because there is an energetic boundary that comes along with having teachers that protects us, that expands us. So just side note, need to say that, especially when we're working in more sensitive realms like sexuality and money and death and, all these areas that we're like, yeah, amazing. But the truth is that there's a lot of shadow energy that functions in these ways, because that's just a part of what they are. They're very human. They're like very like material reality. We can't get around that, but what we can do is start to create the right kind of support for ourselves. So when it comes to self-love, through the practices that welcome your full body, including your sexuality, and for, people with vulvas, including your yoni, and having practices, I've really found that it roots a lot of the spiritual work, quite literally, because you're working with your root, right? And at the same time, we heal a lot of trauma, because we have some trauma mainly from being misinformed. So for example, the G-spot and the G-spot orgasm, which is an internal orgasm different than a clitoral orgasm, as well as the ejaculation that comes from the G-spot, which is most people only know of as squirting from like the porn world. It's so much more than that. It's so much more than like a little spot on the interior wall of your vulva. It's like of your vagina. It's so much more than that. And it's, for example, with squirting, it's more like a flood or a trickle or a gush than it is squirt. When you think about like a squirt, this is how it is for a lot of people. And so just like normalizing and knowing and understanding these things, and also understanding that there's a full body to the G-spot, that it's not just the spot on the interior wall of the vagina, but it's actually the mirror practice that we do. And, the teaching that goes along with it, you can actually see your G-spot with your eyes in a mirror if you know what you're looking for. And then we also share the mapping practice, and mapping is bringing conscious touch to the body. So one of the key elements that brings self-love into our experience of having a body, of being sexual or not, right? It's also like we have periods where we don't feel very sexual, or some people are asexual. Like from the place that I share the work, it really comes down to liberation, because it's really the only thing I care about. So of course I want everybody to have amazing orgasms and manifest their dreams through their orgasms and blah blah blah, but the reality is that sometimes you feel like shit, sometimes you're not turned on, sometimes your arousal is like gone to fucking Mars or God knows where, and you can't find it because there's some deeper rooted issue that's there that's saying, I'm not safe. I'm not, and sometimes it's not because you're actually not safe, right? It's because of trauma, and trauma says it's actually a threat or a perceived threat, right? So even if I'm just feeling unsatisfied with how much romance is in my relationship, sometimes my body's like, you're not safe, and I'm like, well, that's a little extreme. Like, you're safe, bitch, but like, I need some of that right now. I'm not expressing this need I'm having. And then all of a sudden I don't want to fuck. And I'm like, what's going on? You know what I mean? But because I have this relationship, and I also have support. I have no idea how people have fucking relationships romantically and sexually with others without having support. I applaud all of you who can do that, because that is not.
What do you mean support?
I mean, like having a coach or having a therapist or having, practices, having ways to work with your energy. You know what I mean? Like I would be, long gone. But anyway, that's probably because this is my job, so I had to really learn about it through my own experiences. So there's lots of practices that we share, but the main one is the mirror and the mapping, because like I said, it's not just about the goal to orgasm. Even if that is your goal, I totally hold that. But if you're approaching your, first of all, just like approaching your yoni, your vulva, like spot on like that, and it just doesn't work like that. Like, our bodies don't work like that. It's like, I'm gonna do this. It's like very kind of patriarchal, right? It's like, I'm gonna, it's like, even when you're with a lover and they're coming towards you like that, you feel this unspoken expectation, and it doesn't feel good. It's like you really want to feel like however you are is okay, and that's actually what turns a lot of us on. And so I really love creating that beginning foundation for people, and why I tend to attract people that are kind of like, ooh, this is scary, like, I don't, what are you talking about, like the G spot, like, what is mirror, and I tend to because I can really create an environment that includes consent between us and our own bodies, and then also hold this spiritual side to it, that it's like when you're approaching your body, and where body temple comes from, we're approaching our body the same way we would approach a temple. And when you approach a temple, for example, in India, right, you might fly. I mean, I'm from New Jersey originally. I live in California now, but every time I've gone to India, I'd fly for 20 plus hours to get there. And I'd be like, this is why I'm going. Like, I'd have such intention. I'd be like, I need to go. And I don't even know how I made it happen. Like, I need to get this flight, it takes so much. And then you get there and you're like, I'm not going to miss any moment. Like, I'm not going to miss this. I'm going to just be as present as I can, because this is a big fucking deal. I just came all the way to this place, and then when you approach the temple, even traditionally, right? Sometimes there's turtles outside the temple, because they represent you're meant to enter the temple slowly and with intention, right? So you kind of slow everything down. And when it comes to the body, whether we're talking about just the nervous system and releasing stress, which is a huge part of our arousal and libido, stress is like, that's why it goes, And so whether we're talking about just coming out of the stress cycles and responses in our nervous system, fight, flight, fix, fawn, all the things, freeze. I was like, I know I'm forgetting one. Then we need to move more slowly, right? And so when we're approaching our bodies sexually, it's the same way. We're really approaching them from a place of love, and from a place of full permission to be however they need to be. And I think the greatest pleasure and transformation can come from that permission in itself.
Beautiful. And I want to just touch back on, did you say self-consent or consent from ourselves about our own bodies. Can you tell me a little more about that? That sounds
Yeah,
interesting.
I love that. And thank you for bringing that back because it's a really important part of this type of work, self-love work, especially when we're going into this realm of sexuality and of how are we really changing our nervous system? How are we changing? And this is how we change our lives because everything that we perceive about ourselves and the world comes from our autonomic nervous system. So this is why it's changing in our vagal nerve, and that the vagus nerves go down into our wombs, they go into the cervix, they tap into the G spot. So we're actually changing, we could create tremendous change through somatic work. And it's really exciting because we could change a lot of things, spiritually, but then we find ourselves in the same shit storms in relationships, right? This happens all the time. And then we're like, oh my God, like, how could this be? I go to yoga all the time, but then there's this stuckness, right? So some of the primary foundational elements that we need when we're doing this kind of work is consent and choice. Consent, choice, and the element of care, really, which is similar to consent and choice. So when I say choice, it might seem obvious, right? You might be like, well, yeah, of course, like I'm choosing this or I'm choosing that. But the truth is that when we were young, we didn't always have choice, not just around our sexuality, which there might be some serious trauma there, right? Boundary breaches, things like that. But even aside from that, just the way we got love, a lot of times when we were babies, we had to contort all that. Like we learned sometimes how to do that in ways that are really twisted. Some of us grew up around addicts or alcoholics or all kinds of, or just fine people, but they had their own trauma themselves that we were perceiving to be who we are, right? So consent, when it comes to self-consent, it's like if your body is a part of who you are, but you're learning how to heal your relationship to it, right? So you feel disconnected from your body, or you feel like, yeah, I like the idea that the divine is within me, that I get that the body is a temple, whatever, but what does that really mean, right? And so what that means is that we literally will give people the opportunity to like put your hand on your thighs and just like feel the texture of your clothing or your skin for a moment. And before we even move to your vulva, we're going to ask your body, is this a good time for me to touch you right now? And you might get a sense of a yes or a no, or you might not. And in that case, I say choose. You're only going to learn by trying things, right? So if you're like, well, I don't know if my body's saying anything, I don't even know what the fuck that means. Great, just fucking pick one. And then you'll find out pretty soon if it feels good or not, if it feels uncomfortable at a level that you're willing to hold for the sake of some deeper exploration, or if it just feels like too much right now and you could try again later, right?